We have a guest joining us by phone, or actually by Skype, so you'll see him in a moment. He has joined us in the show many times before. His name is Gordon Chang. He's a widely recognized expert about China and other places in that part of the world. He is an author. He wrote The Coming Collapse of China. He wrote Losing South Korea and The Great U.S.-China Tech War, Crouching Tiger, What China's Militarism Means for the World, co-authored by Peter Navarro. So he is an author. He's a widely recognized expert about China, actually lived in Hong Kong, and he's going to join us to bring us up to speed on what's happening with China and Hong Kong. So, hello, Gordon Chang.
Hi, Debbie.
Nice to see you, sir. Thank you for joining us. So, you know, America has been just captured. The news, the headlines have been captured both by the Black Lives Matter riots in the cities around the country and also with coronavirus and COVID-19. But the rest of the world kind of marches on doing its thing. And some of us, myself included, probably not paying enough attention to what is happening between China and Hong Kong. So I want to start with, there was recent unrest in Hong Kong. There was I believe it was an annual march in which people were arrested. Can you describe what that march was supposed to be celebrating?
Yeah, this was the July 1st pro-democracy march. This march has been held every year since 1997, when Britain handed Hong Kong over to the People's Republic. This is the first year that the march was not permitted. And the Hong Kong authorities said, well, you know, this is COVID-19 restrictions. But on that very same day, Debbie, the Hong Kong government held a ceremony for the handover. And that ceremony also violated the Hong Kong government's own COVID-19 rules on social distancing and all the rest of it. So what happened is people in Hong Kong in the thousands took to the streets to protest, even without the permit. And this reason for this year being important is because a few hours earlier, China imposed its national security law on Hong Kong. This is draconian, and people say with justification that this is not just another law. This is the end of law in Hong Kong because it allows China to do whatever it wants in the territory.
Okay, that was a very nice question. I'm glad to have you have raised it. So the new national security law that is bringing such protests and opposition within Hong Kong, what are the basic parameters of it? Tell us why it is so draconian.
Well, it sets out laws on secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreigners that are vague, which means China can actually determine what is a crime. People are going to be tried in the mainland in many cases. And for instance, this law has planetary application. So, for instance, Article 38 says that it applies to conduct outside Hong Kong by foreigners. I'll give you an example. I believe the people in Hong Kong have the right of self-determination. For me to say that on your show is a violation of Article 38, because this would be taken as subversion of China's control of Hong Kong. So this is an attempt by Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, to snuff out any dissent, any criticism. And this is not just going to be criticism of Hong Kong, it's going to be criticism of China as well. So this is an attempt to set the global narrative and to outlaw criticism of communism in China.
Wow, it is the new national security law. People have been writing about saying it was, I did not actually realize it applied to people even outside of China. Things that you're saying in my show would count in the Chinese government's view of the world as violations. That's truly astounding. So back to the march they had in Hong Kong on July 1st. There were something like 300 or 300 plus people arrested. Were they arrested because of violation of this under new national security law, or because they violated the no march, that they didn't have a permit to march?
Yeah, 370 people were arrested, and 10 people were arrested and charged with national security law violations. The first person to be arrested is going to be held until October, no bail, and so essentially incommunicado. And this, again, is something which is very different to Hong Kong. Basically, Hong Kong has prospered because it's had rule of law and an independent judiciary. Well, under the national security law, that's no longer the case, because many of those people who's charged under the law will be tried in mainland courts. This is sort of harks back to last year, those million people demonstrations, 2 million people demonstrations. They were against an extradition bill that China wanted. Now China has that extradition in the form of the national security law.
Did the national security law that China put in place, did any Hong Kong official have input or say, or this was just an edict from China?
Is essentially an edict from China. This is Article 23 of the Basic Law of Hong Kong, which is sometimes called the mini constitution, requires that there will be national security legislation. Now, that legislation has been extremely unpopular in Hong Kong, which is the reason why the Hong Kong Legislative Council has never passed it. Matter of fact, in 2003, on July 1, there was a big demonstration in 90-degree heat against national security rules. So what Beijing decided to do this year was to bypass the Legislative Council in Hong Kong and have these enacted by the National People's Congress, which is the highest organ of state power in the People's Republic. Now, on the National People's Congress Standing Committee, there is one delegate from Hong Kong. But essentially, this was passed without any input from the territory. As a matter of fact, the terms of this law were not disclosed until it actually went into effect at 11 p.m. on June 30.
Wow. Okay, this is really, and honestly, for people watching this situation, I know many people watching the protests in Hong Kong over the last year and more, and I think a lot of people thought, wow, maybe China's going to have to rethink its attitude toward Hong Kong, its repressive attitude toward its own people. Maybe they'll have to realize they need to maybe join the 21st century and be part of freeing up people. But this is a signal from Xi Jinping. I'm asking it, isn't this a signal from Xi Jinping that he has no intention of lifting his draconian eventual rule over Hong Kong and current rule over the Chinese people? Isn't it like a signal from them?
Well, it certainly is a signal. You know, what we're seeing in China itself is a move away from authoritarianism to a totalitarian form of government. In other words, going back to the first years of the People's Republic. And you see this with the social credit system, with 626 million surveillance cameras that are supposed to be in place by the end of this year, by so many other things where Xi Jinping demands absolute obedience. Well, he's taking that system and he's applying it to Hong Kong. And of course, his ambitions are global because Xi Jinping has been dropping hints that he believes that China is the world's only sovereign state and he's the world's only legitimate ruler. So his view of the world is audacious. Now, he's never had the ability to extend that China rules the world view on others, but he's moving in that direction, especially as he sees the United States stricken by coronavirus,
which happened to come to us from China, but I won't go there right now. I do want to go back to, there was a commentary, within China itself, didn't the Chinese government recently crack down on one dissident within China, a professor who has been an outspoken critic? Do you know what I'm talking about? There was a recent event of that kind.
Yeah, you're referring to a Tsinghua University law professor, Zhu Zhongran, who was taken into custody about 3 or 4 days ago. He was a prominent critic. He is openly criticizing the abolition of term limits for the presidency, which is the least important of Xi Jinping's posts. He's also been a critic of the Communist Party's handling of the coronavirus epidemic inside China. He had been actually quite free to say what he wanted. Many people thought that he was actually protected by elements in the Communist Party, which is the reason why he could say those things. But now it appears that Xi Jinping has been able to prevail over those other elements. And that's an indication that Xi Jinping has become even stronger.
Very alarming feeling in China. So I want to talk for a moment, if we can, about how the United States, what, if anything, the United States could or should do about it. I'm aware of one bill. I think it passed the House and the Senate. I don't know where it stands. I believe it's called the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. That may not be the right term, but there was a new bill that Congress is looking at, trying to, in a way, help out Hong Kong. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. It passed both houses of Congress without a dissenting vote. It is now on the president's desk. President Trump has not said whether he'll sign it or not, which is causing some alarm among people who are in favor of protecting Hong Kong. I believe he will sign it for the simple reason that it's got a veto-proof majorities in both houses. President Trump's senior officials this week, Secretary of State Pompeo, Attorney General Barr, FBI Director Chris Wray, they've all been talking in unusually harsh tones. We have heard Chief of Staff Mark Meadows say that there's going to be soon a number of executive orders on China and related topics. I suspect that the president will be signing the Autonomy Act this week. We'll just have to wait and see. But this is going to shape up to be a consequential week when it comes to our relations with China.
Yes, in fact, I'd love to have you expound more on the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, because I understood it has some teeth if President Trump signs it, becomes law. So what can it do in terms of helping the people of Hong Kong and eventually pushing back against the totalitarian Chinese government?
There's really two sets of measures in it. First, there are the authority to impose sanctions on officials who have eroded Hong Kong's autonomy. That's not going to get any Chinese or Hong Kong official terribly upset. But what can happen under the bill is that the Treasury Department can impose costs on Chinese banks that maintain relationships with those officials who have been sanctioned. And some of the punishments in that bill are actually quite severe, including the loss of privilege to conduct transactions in dollars. In other words, a sanctioned bank might not be able to maintain a corresponding banking relationship in New York, which means it can't transact business in dollars. That's a death sentence for an international bank. So that is more than just teeth. That really is a very effective measure.
That sounds actually, that sounds tremendous and wonderful and good. The idea that our Congress, we can't really force China to stop interfering in Hong Kong, or we can't change China's law, but we could actually, this act you're describing, the ability of the Treasury Department to actually function and say, as a result of a sanction, that these banks cannot function in America. That sounds like it has bigger impact even than just hurting particular banks. Isn't that going to reverberate in the whole Chinese economy?
Well, certainly. I mean, because if you have, let's say, a Bank of China, which is one of China's banks, if it maintains a relationship with one of these sanctioned officials, and if the U.S. were to cut off its ability to transact business in dollars, it would affect Bank of China's business, not only in the United States, but Hong Kong, elsewhere around the world. It would basically be, as I mentioned, an end to Bank of China as a going concern. And that, of course, would shake the Chinese banking system, the Chinese financial system, the Chinese economy, could even lead to the fall of the Communist Party. And this really leads to one observation, and that is the U.S. has so much power to affect China. We don't use that power for various reasons, and that's a very long conversation why we don't. But the point is, we do have the leverage to push China in directions we want. It's just been a question of political will, whether we be willing to do those things.
Sir, I hope we have that long conversation sometime about other things America could do, because I know there are people who would say basically America should sit back, protect our country. Hong Kong's not really our problem. China's kind of, they're over there. They have their country. We have ours. But honestly, the Chinese Communist Party is particularly, and more, as you're saying, going from, they're becoming totalitarian, not simply authoritarian. The people in China suffer. The people in Hong Kong, who have many kind of grown up with a sense of freedom, are facing impending loss of all of their freedoms. And I'd love to have that longer conversation. But one last question for today. So in our streets in America, we've had protests that, in my view, have nothing to do with George Floyd in Minneapolis. But we've had protests which have involved property destruction, arson, killing of people, smashing of windows. And it's not just the violence in the streets, but language coming out of various left-wing movements in this country, including Antifa. And Black Lives Matter puts out statements, very Marxist statements. Do you think that the Marxist agitation we are seeing in our streets in America, is any of it being pushed by China, or is this really, is it being pushed by China, and also doesn't it make America look weak in the eyes of China?
Well, it certainly is pushed by China because the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Global Times, which is a Communist Party tabloid, have been engaged in a malicious disinformation campaign with regard to as soon as the George Floyd protests started. So Beijing has been trying to stir the pot. And I'm sure that we have probably been the object of China's bot farms and trolls and the rest of it, because as the New York Times reported in April, China, in about the middle of March, actually unleashed their trolls, propagating narratives that they knew were false. We also know from statements that protesters around the White House have said that they were working with the Chinese government. I don't know how credible those statements are, but nonetheless, they should lead us to investigate this. And one other thing. At the end of January, Customs and Border Protection in Minnesota seized $900,000 worth of counterfeit $1 bills. Nobody counterfeits $1 bills for profit. These bills came from China. Nobody in China could counterfeit currency without the Communist Party knowing about it. And so the question is, why were these bills coming into the United States from China with no commercial motivation at all? So we've got to be concerned that China was trying to at least fuel the protests with money. And so I'm not saying that that is the case. I'm saying that is something we absolutely need to investigate. Also because we have seen from China parts for automatic weapons being smuggled into the U.S., again from China. Nobody could make those parts in China without the party knowing about it.
Gordon Chang, I only have, now that you said those last two things, I wish we had a 2-hour time slot to talk today, because I did hear that story about the $900,000 in $1 bills seized by America's customs people, and they seem to have come from China. As you say, no one bothers to counterfeit $1 bills. There had to be a nefarious intent, some intent, and obviously $1 bills may be used to pay, I know it's speculation, circumstantial, used to pay protesters, simple money, untraceable money coming from China, and it's counterfeit. And so it's really a great potential signal that China was very much involved in agitating or maybe even paying these protesters. Wow. That's quite the story. Okay, so Gordon Chang, if people want to find you, they can find you I think on Twitter, it's at Gordon G. Chang.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
That is right.
Okay. And honestly, Gordon Chang, I love every time you join us. I have the same feeling when we finish talking. Now I have many more questions. But I want to thank you so much for taking time to join me today on America Can We Talk.
Oh, and I want to thank you so much for the opportunity, because these are such consequential issues in such consequential times.
They most certainly are. I hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you, Gordon.
Thanks, Debbie.
Okay, folks, I'm telling you, these things are scary. I mean, I didn't even get to all the questions because I know he has a time thing too today, and I didn't want to go too long. But what he's talking about, this is a gentleman, and he's lived in Hong Kong. He is an expert on the relationship between China and Hong Kong, also in the Chinese Communist Party. And he made one allusion to it. I want to wrap up this segment with this interview to make a couple points I didn't get to with him. One is, Gordon Chang has frequently talked about the idea that the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, the current leader of the Chinese Communist Party, he is the dictator. He is moving not to open his society, as many Americans and others around the world hoped, the globalist thinkers hoped, that somehow China would begin to surrender its authoritarian control over its society if we Westerners just showed them how great, look what freedom does, look how great America is. And they're trending in actually the completely opposite direction. But this one little story we talked about their conduct toward Hong Kong, cracking down on the protesters, recognizing Hong Kong, the people of Hong Kong actually want their freedom. They want to be able to do their annual march in the streets. And the government of China feels perfectly comfortable cracking down on people daring to march, cracking down on dissidents in their own country. That one professor we mentioned was arrested. Other dissidents, as concerned, are being rounded up too at this time. So we have China very determined to become the single world power. They see themselves that way. An ancient Chinese doctrine that we've talked about on this show with Gordon Chang numerous times holds the notion that China was intended ultimately to rule the world. that the Chinese people were intended to be the people, the ethnicity, the people who rule the world. That was the idea in ancient China, and it is a doctrine that Xi Jinping has again brought to the fore in this time as leader of the Chinese Communist Party. So we live in an era where we have a great threat to America's well-being, not just because China wants to be the one superpower, because they are aggressive communists, because they are cracking down on anyone in their society trying to speak up for freedom, but also because they think this is their role at this time, and they see America as weak. They see America as weakened by the coronavirus, weakened by the Marxists in our street agitating against freedom, weakened, frankly, by people like Ilhan Omar, whom we mentioned at the start of our show, who are advocating for Marxist ideas about the government must provide housing and free education and free health care. And she even talks about must provide housing for all people. These are very Marxist ideas. China loves her ideas. And this is an elected member of Congress spouting those ideas to the American people. There is a grave danger to America not to take the threat of China seriously. I am very grateful that President Trump seems to be taking them seriously. Reset worked away with trade terms that China was not about to allow China to continue its decades of mistreatment of America, America's workers and businesses and products that had come to be based on years and years of trade deals that favored China and disfavored America. I hope President Trump goes ahead and signs that bill, because I think that China, they don't understand anything except brute force. And if President Trump can sign that bill that is now out of the House and Senate unanimously, rare thing in these days in America, that is going to give some teeth to the idea of supporting Hong Kong's autonomy and potentially even begin to have the impact of crippling big banks in China, this would be a great day for freedom in China, Hong Kong, and the world.